I'm going to start recording, and really, if I forget, I know somebody reminded me last time. It's one of those details that's easy for me to forget. So feel free to remind me when I do. All right, let me go to screen share. Uh, let's see. Okay, go back to the beginning. So today, um, we're going to discuss what we call the synthetic method. And we've talked about the process of inductive Bible study being observation, interpretation, correlation, and application. And right alongside that, we're employing two methodologies, the synthetic method and the analytic method. The synthetic method is basically getting the big picture and getting the overview and setting some context for a more detailed study of the passage. I think the first week we talked about this briefly, that basically the Bible study method is, or process is really what they call a hermeneutical circle. You go between, you start with the whole, the big picture, you go down to the study of the parts, and where we apply our processes of interpretation. That gives us a greater understanding of the whole. So we go back up and we make adjustments and that sort of thing. So that's an ongoing process for us. So the synthetic overview is that it is a big picture, and it's primarily the observation stage, and it will be for our class in the inductive Bible study method. So in this process, we are just observing the first time through the synthetic method. You're just simply observing what the passage or what the book as a whole. We're going to be applying this to the book of Titus. And that will be your exercises and assignments for this coming week. But we want to get the big picture. So we begin with observation, getting the big picture, and then we move down to the parts. And that's where one gets into the analytical study. And we'll introduce the parts of that briefly in a couple minutes. And this is our interpretation. So as we do the analytical study, we are also doing the interpretation of the passage. Having done that, we gain a greater understanding of part of the whole. And so we naturally can go back up and we now can revise that synthetic uh, overview of the book. So it'll grow and increase. And having done that, we might go back down to the same passage, and there will be additional analysis and interpretation. And as you stretch this out over the years and studying the same passage, you just sort of continue this hermeneutical circle. And we end up coming to a more clear, a more full understanding of passages as we continue to study them throughout the year. And so if you remember this little diagram from the first time together, here we call it a hermeneutical circle. Some people prefer to call it a hermeneutical spiral, where, as we start with a look at the whole and then we study the parts, so we reevaluate the whole, go back to the parts. You go to this process, and the more you study a passage over the years, the better your understanding will become. And so we get closer to the truth, to a fuller understanding of the truth. And so that's kind of how this works and how we will be proceeding. an overview of the synthetic method involves the following steps. You begin by reading the book several times. So you're going to be reading the book of Titus in one sitting. That's why I chose a short book. It won't take but 15 minutes or so at a time. But you do that 2, 3, 4 times. And just to begin to get a sense of what the book as a whole is all about. I'm going to ask you to write what is called an argument of the book. And that goes paragraph by paragraph through the book. And it's a short summary of each paragraph in your own words. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. I'll ask you to do both paragraph and chapter charts. And this is where, sort of in a visual way, you can take some short notes, give that paragraph chart or give that chapter chart a title, which will help you remember, and then put it all together into a book chart or a book outline. We're not going to do the outline part of it. Any New Testament, Old Testament introduction, or if you have a study Bible, each book of the Bible will start with a short introduction, which usually includes an outline of the book. So I'm not going to have you do that, but the book chart, I think, is a handy tool that really gives a good visual overview of a book. And then some introductory reading. We're not going to do that in the assignment. That'll be a part of your analysis, but by that introduction, meaning certain things like author, purpose, main themes, and that sort of thing. So, and just to make note that while we're going to be talking about doing book charts and doing it as looking at the book as a whole, you can follow the same procedure for smaller units of the Bible. Practically speaking, in the course of everyday life and so much going on, one doesn't have the time to do all of this. We're doing all of it to kind of get the idea and build the practice and the habit and the mindset that allows us to do this. So even if I'm just studying a paragraph, I can do a paragraph chart. I can write an argument for the few paragraphs before and after the paragraph I might be studying or teaching or preaching on, and those sorts of things. So this can be applied in any sort of way. Now, the steps in the analytical method that we'll start to get into next week is contextual analysis, and this is both historical and cultural context as well as literary context. Literary context referring to the literature of the Bible, or even the individual book that you're studying in, putting it into its immediate literary context. We'll take a look at a little bit at structural analysis. This has to do with genre, issues of genre, and different considerations. You'll be doing some reading on that. This will be taking into consideration the structure of a passage. And that structure is going to vary depending on the genre. We are looking at epistolary material. And so we're going to follow a very kind of logical prose structural approach. And one of the things I'll introduce is how to do a mechanical layout, which can then be converted into an outline for the passage, so that we can really identify what the author himself is saying and how it's being taught to us. Again, especially if you end up taking Greek, you will get into the structural analysis in much more detailed. But this is the kind of approach that one can do without Greek or without Hebrew. And one of the things, I know that we're taking this in a master's level course, but all of this is very applicable and can be taught to lay folk as well, to lay people as well. I learned much of the inductive Bible study method as a college student in a secular university, just through Bible studies, which some of which were intentionally designed as inductive Bible study, sometimes through a staff member of Campus Crusade for Christ, sometimes just as a group of students. And so interesting, when I did go to seminary and took exegetical methods, I realized that I had already been practicing most of this anyway. And so this is something that people that we minister to can learn and really should be taught at some point so they too can study scripture well. The analytical method will also talk about syntactical analysis, grammar and syntax, those kind of relations. This will take us back to that whole list of literary devices and grammatical considerations that we introduced last time. And then we'll do lexical analysis, which is the meaning of words. And then finally, the interpretation, or putting it all together. You're actually doing interpretation even as you're doing all of these analyses, but we will cover each of these in a separate week moving forward. And then part of your final project will be to take the passage that you're going to be working on, Titus 2:11 to 14, and then turn that into a teaching or a preaching outline. And so basically, we're going to move from Bible study into biblical communication, at least in how we teach, how we might teach a passage that really reflects what the author is saying in that passage. So that's kind of just an overview of the synthetic and the analytical method. Any questions on that introduction? Okay. Okay, well, let's look at the synthetic method. And all of this is really very straightforward. In its learning, I have put a folder for week 4 just called resources. And I have these examples as well as some other examples that you can look at. By way of definition, by the synthetic method, we're talking about the method of approaching a book of the Bible as a whole, and then seeks to understand its meaning as a whole. So this is the first step. And interestingly, after I had learned this myself in more detail, I came across a book by Mortimer Adler called How to Read a Book. He was a professor of literature in the middle of last century from the University of Chicago. And the whole point of his book, well, there were two interesting points that I got from the book. One is that his thesis is that we read too many books. Being a professor of classic literature, his thing was, well, we need to read fewer books, but we need to learn how to read them well and thoughtfully. And so he would have a list of the important classical works throughout history that have significantly influenced Western civilization. And but I took to heart his point that we need to really identify important books and really read them carefully. And his approach, he didn't use this, but his was a whole approach. So he basically said any book of significance that you read, you should do it in 3 readings. The first time is to quickly go through the book and in one reading, and just to get overview of the main idea. What are the main themes? How is the author developing his points? What are his points going to be? And then second time you go through carefully, and you go through slowly, and you go through thoughtfully, and really digest and understand. Be sure that you understand what the author is writing. And then you read through a third time, and again, that's a fast reading, and just to kind of see the whole again in light of your detailed understanding of the parts. So here is coming from a completely secular approach, but advocating the same method that we use in biblical interpretation. So whole part, whole. So here in the synthetic part, we just really are looking for the big idea. The word synthesis comes from two Greek words, syn, which means together, the Greek the root meaning means to put, or simply to put together. So take the parts, put them together. And when we do that, we're synthesizing. But also note that the synthetic method presupposes that an author has a purpose and structure to their writing, which is very true. Whenever anybody writes a book, they write it because they have a purpose. They write it because they have some objectives that they want to accomplish, points that they want to make. They have thought through how they are going to make that point, and so on and so forth. We usually will find that in the introduction of the book. A good author will include that in the introduction so that the reader knows the purpose, the goals, the procedure that the author is going to use. And so this is kind of like reading an introduction, kind of getting that big picture. The goal of the synthetic method is to develop an understanding of the big picture by making a preliminary judgment on the theme, or could be themes, the purpose, the argument, or how the author intends to lay out an argument, and some of the other main ideas that are going to be important to the book as a whole. And so I'm going to have you do this for the book of Titus. The basic procedure is to explain the book as a whole through repeated readings, and to integrate the results of those readings into a book chart or an outline. Again, we're not going to do the outline, but one could do outlines as well. And this becomes foundational for interpreting the book, as well as the individual passages within the book. The importance of the synthetic method is that it provides that big picture view. Think of it as a jigsaw puzzle. We probably all have done jigsaw puzzles. And imagine that somebody had given us a box with 500 pieces, cut pieces, but there was no picture on the box. And so our task was to put that puzzle together without having seen a picture of what we're trying to put together. If you've done a jigsaw puzzle, you know that would be difficult. Could be done. I'm sure it could be done. I've never tried. But it would be so much more difficult than having a picture of what that puzzle will look like when we're finished. And so the big picture guides us with the small parts. It provides a preliminary context for analysis and interpretation. And that's important because context is integral to all forms of communication. Communication doesn't take place unless there's context. You could have a word, but a word doesn't take meaning until it's in the context of a sentence. And you can take a sentence, but the sentence takes on, complete and fuller meaning in the context of a passage or a paragraph. and the paragraph within the context of other paragraphs, and so on. So context is important. I have a friend who loves to use indefinite pronouns and personal and impersonal pronouns. So she'll just start a sentence with he or with it, and we'll go on for a while, and I finally have to stop. Well, now who is he? You know, give me a context. Or she'll start talking about something. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. What does it refer to? What are you speaking to? So really, communication is never complete, can never really take place unless we put it into a context. So interpretation requires context, and this helps give us an initial and preliminary context. And I underline preliminary because it is preliminary, especially for this course, because we are starting with observation, our own observation. We're not going to, I don't want you, and you're not allowed to use any resources on this week's assignments. And even for the next few weeks, we're going to have you do things so that you're not consulting, you know, an outline in your Bible, or you're not consulting a commentary or anything like this, but you are just using your own eyes and seeing what you come up with on your own. So I'll keep emphasizing this. But one of the key objectives of this class is for you to grow in your confidence to see well and to begin the process of interpretation, making your own judgments before you start consulting commentaries and other resources. Commentaries and other resources are very important. We need to confer them. We need to check our own conclusions, and there's going to be more information that we just didn't know through biblical resources. But a major goal of this class is for you to be able to make some preliminary judgments on your own and gain confidence in doing that. So some of the steps that we're going to use in our assignment. The first step is just your initial readings to get the big picture. And the goal again is to make general observations and then to identify the purpose, audience, and themes. Your tools, Bible and paper only. So again, I'm not wanting you to go to any other resources. What you do is, as you read through, is you take notes looking for statements in the book of Titus, in this example, as to what is the purpose? Why did Paul write this book? And so look and see what you can find throughout the book that would identify a purpose for the book. Always keeping in mind the 6 questions: who, what, where, why, when, and how. But who is the book written to or written about? And so look for clues in there as to who is written to, who are the people or the groups of people that are being written to, and so on. And then look for major themes. This is kind of the what. What is this book going to be about? That you begin to see as you go through this process. You can look for certain key ideas or concepts, what really stands out in what the author is wanting to do. Of course, the larger the book, you get into the Gospels or some of the larger books, this becomes a little more difficult. But we still want to kind of look for those main ideas. One of the ways that you can do this is to look for repeated words or repeated concepts that are going to be likely in through part of it. Keep in mind the principle of selectivity. Every author chooses the material for his writing that he believes is going to accomplish his purpose. You think of the Gospel of John, for example. Jesus gives us a statement of purpose in John 21. Jesus did many more things, John says, than I've written in this gospel, but these signs I've included in order that you may know that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and through him you might have salvation. However that goes more precisely. But John nicely gives us a statement of purpose for his gospel. But he even tells us there's a lot more that he could have included, but he selected those 7 major signs in order to demonstrate that Jesus is the Son of God and that through him we have salvation. Sometimes you can identify this by how much space is given to certain material. You think of the book of Genesis, for example. Creation and the fall takes place in 3 chapters. And in the book of Genesis, Genesis means beginning, so Genesis is the book of beginnings. Then you have, for the next 6 chapters, the spread of sin leading up to God's judgment with the flood. But then from chapter 12 on to the end, to chapter 50, you have 3 generations, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Joseph. And so we got a small amount dealing with creation, a little bit more that just gives us a picture of the spread of sin. But then you have the beginning of the nation of Israel, beginning with Abraham. And so most of Genesis deals with the patriotic fathers of Israel. The Gospels are similar. All of the Gospels, somewhere between 1/3 to 40% of the total Gospels is dealing with the last week of Jesus' life, the Passion Week. So the events leading directly up to his arrest, his crucifixion, and then finally his resurrection. So the majority is, so this gives us an insight that, this last week, Jesus' death and resurrection is really where all of the life of Christ is leading to. And so the principle of selectivity is something that you can look for. So in this, always keep those 6 questions in mind. Again, we're not interpreting, we're just observing. We want to see what's there and then form some conclusions of what the big picture is all about. But then put your observations. So as you read, take notes and then put your observations into what I call an audience, a purpose audience and themes summary. Summarize it in some way. And this is an example of how you can do that, just using a chart. That out of the way. So this is for the book of Galatians. This I did many years ago. And just through my own reading of Galatians, before I had spent any time studying the parts. And I went through and read the book of Galatians 3 or 4 times, taking notes, looking for statements of audience, purpose, and themes. And then just began to, and then finally just sort of made note of those verses. So on this, I have to move this around a bit. On this first column, as I go through, I just made these observations about the who is the audience, or who's being written about or to. So chapter 1, verse 2, it's written to the churches in Galatia. So I underline plural, just to remind me it's not just one church. Then in chapter 2, 8, and 9, oh, that should be chapter 1. I'm sorry, that's a mistake. Chapter 1, 8, and 9, Paul introduces himself as an apostle to the Gentiles. So this is sort of a who statement. He identifies himself. And then chapter 2, the issue suggests a Gentile audience. Who was he writing to? What was the church made of? Titus, who was a Greek, was not compelled to be circumcised. Now, Peter, who lives like a Gentile, because he's saved by faith, not by the law, also he's not abiding by the regulations of Judaism, is later compelling the Galatians to live like the Jews, and which to me suggests that he's not speaking to Jews. Later understanding of the book of Galatians, I would need to correct that. I think the general thinking is that depending on where these churches were located, they may have been primarily Jews or a mixture of Jews and Gentiles. But anyway, this is my first time through. And if I were to kind of go through and I could correct this and make it more accurate. But then 323, are they Jewish? So this is kind of the observation stage. Galatians, are they Jews? Are they Jews and Gentiles? These are all question marks. I don't know the answer to this at the time. Were held prisoners by the law. So now Paul's talking to some who seem to have been practicing the law. They were converted under Judaism. Verse 22, the whole world has been held prisoner to the elementary principles of the world. 4:5, to redeem those under the law. But usually Paul taught Christ redeemed all, so on and so forth. So these are observations. So having made some of these observations, my first conclusion as to the audience, again, based on my own reading, I didn't consult any introductory material, is that the recipients were Gentile believers whose salvation was the result of Paul's ministry. Their formerly close and caring relationship was at risk. Again, that's a judgment I would question and I would reevaluate at this point. But this is the first time through. This is preliminary. Then in the second column, statements of purpose. Things that stood out to me were 1:6, Paul says, I'm astonished that you're so quickly deserting the one who called you by grace. Or the first 5 verses of chapter 3, he asks a number of questions. And he says, having begun by grace, so by the Holy Spirit, are you now trying to attain the goal by your own effort? And then he refers to those people, which the context of Galatians suggests is a group known as the Judaizers, zealously trying to alienate the Galatian believers from Paul. And he asks, do you want to be under the law? Don't you know that that leads to slavery? Showing Paul's purpose that, they're moving back into the areas of bondage, which he says a number of times. He expresses concern that the error will spread even beyond themselves. And then verse 13 of chapter 5, don't recall that verse offhand, but does this verse suggest that some of the believers were motivated to be under the law for the discipline of holiness because some were abusing the freedom of Christ? So is that part of the motivation that Paul is addressing? So that's more of a question mark, something that I would want to look into later. So my summary of the purpose of the book of Galatians was that Paul writes to confront and correct the apparently successful efforts of a group of people who are trying to impose the law of Judaism upon Galatian believers. And with some tweaking, that would be a pretty good summary of the purpose of Paul's writing. And then the same thing. I won't go through all of this, but the same thing with various themes. Uh, just to take note, repeated ideas of grace, of freedom, of bondage and enslavement, of the law, so on and so forth. You know, even in chapter 3, the law is so much apart, redeemed from the law in verse 13. Faith and promises contrasted with the law in verse 15. We're no longer under the law in verse 25. We're sons of God by faith in verse 26. And then in chapter 5, 4 and 5, there's a contrast between faith and law again. So my initial summary of the theme or main ideas was suggested that it's probably best reflected in chapter 2, verses 8 to 21, and then again in chapter 5, verse 1, where verse 1 he says, you have been set aside, you have been called to freedom, so don't lose it, don't go back into bondage. So I summarize by saying salvation is by faith, resulting in freedom in Christ, and continue to live in this freedom through faith. Don't become enslaved to legalism or to the former ways. So this is again just from 2 or 3 or 4 full readings of the book, and you'll be doing this for Galatians, and just making these observations and forming your own initial summary about the book of Titus. Do you have any questions about this? Okay.
No question, but a comment maybe.
Sure.
Aside from what I'm seeing, what I'm really interested to hear from you. What is your take on this? Whether we should have full-time pastors being at full-time work, because what I'm seeing requires someone to be somewhere seated for long hours and studying.
Yeah, you're talking about ILU, okay, Kenya?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. What I'm saying is there's usually a discussion between whether pastors should be full-time or part-time, or should be working on something on the side while pastoring, or they should fully actually be just doing the work of ministry. And based on the work that I'm seeing here, yeah, I'd like to hear your comment.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's I see a couple of things in that. Of course, one of the benefits and responsibilities in full-time ministry is the opportunity to spend more time in preparing weekly for the ministry that you're going to be doing. So, if I think of a pastor, for example, the pastor needs time to prepare the message. But also, I think, especially as a full-time pastor, but I would say every pastor, to the degree that they're able to, has the responsibility to be a lifetime student of the Word. That's really one of the most important activities in the pastoral ministry, because their role is to, lead a group of people in the way that God wants those people to go. So in a sense, the pastor is like a priest. In our evangelical circles, we don't treat it like the priesthood of the Old Testament or necessarily like the priesthood of the Catholic Church. But you are in a role where the people expect you to explain God to them. Who is God? What does God want? How are they to live? And we need to know God's word. And we need to be lifetime students of the word, because that understanding grows and matures throughout the years. So ideally, one can do it full time. And certainly that would be desired. But circumstances also dictate at times where that's not possible. And that can be for a variety of reasons. It might be starting a small church, and there's no capacity for the church to support the ministry at that point, or maybe doing this in a new region, and where you work part-time and other work, and then you minister. And that can be in pastoral ministry, that can be in other forms of ministry. And even universities and Bible colleges can struggle with those issues, because everyone would love to have a full-time faculty, but that's expensive, and not everybody can do that yet. But we're also learning that with the internet and so on, there's many effective ways to do teaching without being on a full-time faculty and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think it's, if I get your question right, I think that's how I would answer that.
Yes, I think
But
I'm answered. It's
okay.
ideally, it is ideal to be full-time, but
Yes.
circumstantially, the case is
Yeah.
part-time.
Yeah. And we leave it to God, one of the benefits, we lose sight of it. One of the dangers in ministry is that we become isolated from the world. I served as a pastor for 9 years, served on the faculty of IOUK for many years. And you're so busy with your responsibility in the organization or institution that you have no time outside of that. So after a while, Christians and you're around Christians, and you really have no significant contact with non-Christians. And you lose that opportunity to influence outside of the walls of the church or the institution, because you have to have relationships. You have to be in context. One of the benefits of being part-time and working in another area is that you will have contact with non-Christians. And you can't even pastors can do this, but you can take initiative with your neighbors and be sure to build relationships. But as I look back, I did more evangelism, and I'm committed to the Great Commission and evangelism. I did more evangelism before I went into full-time Christian ministry. Because as a college student, I was living with college students. I was on a secular university. And so, if I was willing to take the initiative, there was a lot of opportunities. I worked in a blood gas laboratory for a year before I joined the ministry of Campus Crusade for Christ. And during that year, there were 13 employees in the lab, and the lab worked round the clock, 24 hours. And in the course of that year, I worked all the shifts, and I had a chance to share Christ with every one of my fellow employees because I was with them and engaged in the things that they were engaged in building relationships with non-Christians. So there is something to be said, and even for part-time. But we also want to encourage that vision and mindset in the lay people in our churches. We want them to understand that they are called to mission just as you and I are called to mission. But they're called to do it as a teacher, a banker, a construction worker, whatever it is, they're working in. They are God's missionary in that context. And so we want them to see the purpose of their lives that way. We want to, as churches, equip them to be able to be effective in that. So there's pros and cons on all of these sides. So we trust God to raise up the people that he needs.
Amen.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Doctor.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for articulating this episode in such a clear manner. I greatly appreciate that. Then I wanted to ask a question in
Yeah.
regard to our analysis. Okay, number one, I would want to know what is Judaism and how is it being portrayed in the book of Galatia, as we've just seen through the analysis that you have presented.
Yeah. Well, that understanding has come from later study. It didn't come through the first stages like the synthetic method. But the Judaizers, they're called Judaizers, and these were believers that were converted from Judaism into Christianity. But their traditional Jewish faith continued to be very important to them. So they had come to the point of understanding that Jesus was indeed the expected Messiah, the Son of God, and that his atonement was the basis for salvation. But they also thought, well, God had called Abraham and Moses and the nation of Israel to be his people, and that is still very important to us. And so they were convinced that there are still certain things that, even though I'm a Christian and no longer a Jew per se, I am a Jewish person who's a Christian, and even the Gentiles should do some of the things. So the Old Testament taught that every Jew or every Jewish convert should be circumcised. So they were advocating that new believers should be circumcised, and especially if you happen to be Jewish, but most likely they were circumcised already. And they were advocating keeping the law in the way that Judaism was keeping the law in Jesus' day, and celebrating the festivals and so on and so forth. So they were saying, yes, we're saved through faith in Christ. However, we still need to keep doing these Jewish things. And so they were pulling, especially the Gentiles, into practicing their Christianity. And in the book of Galatians, Paul, you read the first chapter, verses 6-9. I mean, he's really upset because the gospel itself, the nature of the gospel itself, was being changed. And as he goes throughout the book, moving away from a gospel of faith through grace and promise to a gospel that required works and practicing the law. So this is what the Judaizers were doing. And so they were becoming divisive. They were saying, we cannot abandon the Jewish faith. We've got to, and all new converts should become a part of that, as well as be followers of Jesus. And so the book of Galatians is all about Paul confronting this distortion of the gospel and his argument for why the law does not play a role in salvation, in the coming of salvation. It didn't mean that there are parts of the law that are unimportant, but especially the ritualistic parts of the law were not required for a Gentile Christian or even for a Jewish Christian after the time of Christ. Yeah, so that is a good book to read. Everybody should read that and study the book of Galatians carefully. And I used to use it for exegetical methods, but it was so long, so I went to a shorter book like Titus instead. Okay?
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? All right, let's move on. So the first reading, read the book several times. I say one reading, but several readings, and then look for the audience, the purpose, and the themes. The second reading is writing out an argument of the book. An argument meaning the development of the book. How did, in the case of Titus, once we have an idea of the purpose, why it was written and who it was written to, how does Paul develop his thought or make his case or address the problem? This is the development of how the book develops. And this is called the argument. So the goal is to unravel the logical development argument of the book, or just simply you can think the flow of thought of the book. This helps to identify and clarify really the purpose, the theme, and how the author accomplished his purpose. The procedure is to read each paragraph carefully, thoughtfully, and then in one or two sentences state what the paragraph is about and how it fits with the previous paragraphs. And so you're looking at the flow, the content as well as the flow. And this is more of an aside, but even as you do this, write down any other observations that you make in the paragraph that may become important, that stand out to you, that when you get to the interpretation phase, that you want to pursue. So let me give an example from the book of Galatians for a couple of chapters. Just restating what was already said, the purpose of an argument is to trace the development of a book of the Bible. The purpose of doing this is to help you see the book as a whole. You really are forced to determine how each part, really, and we're going to approach it paragraph by paragraph, relates to the others. It helps to see what the author's purpose in writing is and how the author himself develops his thought. And this is an example of tracing the development in the book of Galatians. Again, I emphasize this is preliminary. You're still in the observation phase. So you're reading and making your own observations without consulting any other sources. And so this means that once you study more in depth the passage, you're very likely to reshape even your statement in the argument. And that's okay. That's part of the process. So the first 5 verses of chapter 1 in Galatians, I just simply summarize: in greeting the Galatian church, Paul asserts that his apostleship is of divine, not human origin, and that Jesus' sacrifice for sin was to rescue us from this present evil age. And then the second paragraph, verses 6 to 9, I summarize the reason for Paul's letter is stated. The Galatians were deserting Christ for a distorted gospel. And of course, that is a serious issue. In my NIV version, the third paragraph or verse 10 stands as its own paragraph. So I treat it that way. So Paul's motive in addressing this problem is to serve God, not man. So you notice that I try to use certain words that indicate what's happening in that paragraph. So the second one, I state the reason for Paul's letter, in my judgment at this point. Here, it's the motive. And we're going to get some insight into the motive. And this begins to string the flow of thought as Paul moves through. Then in verses 11, 12, Paul asserts the exclusively divine origin of the gospel he preaches. And then in verses 13 to 14, move this out of the way, Paul begins to defend the previous statement, the statement above. So by stating that, I'm showing a connection between this paragraph and the paragraph before. So here now Paul becomes apologetic. He gets to defend what he had said above. by relating that when he received God's revelation of Jesus Christ, he was neither seeking this revelation, nor did he consult anyone. So he's making the point that the gospel he preaches has come directly from God, not from anybody else, or not because he was seeking this. This wasn't his purpose at all. Incidentally, I'm reminded by this statement that he wasn't seeking this revelation. Some years ago, I didn't do an exhaustive study of the Bible, but I was curious, and I looked for instances where God spoke to various people of the Bible, whether they be Moses or prophets, and so on and so forth. And one of the things I observed is that in only one case, there's only one exception to this that I found, that the prophet was never seeking a revelation when God revealed himself or spoke to that prophet. And the exception to that is in the book of Daniel, where Daniel was in prayer seeking. But the typical practice is that God, and this just reminds us that God is the one who speaks when he deems that he needs to speak through the prophets or anybody else. It doesn't come from human initiative. It always comes from divine initiative. And that's something even for us to keep in mind in our own day when, we hear that, somebody says, well, God has given me a word, or somebody is seeking a revelation. Generally, God doesn't reveal himself in those kind of ways when we're seeking it, not in an all inclusive way like scriptural revelation. But that's a little aside. In the end of chapter 1, the last paragraph. So Paul continues. So I use the word continue to make it clear that what's been going on before is continuing even in this paragraph by stating that only after 3 years did he meet Peter, and then only briefly. He met no others, but went off to Syria and Cilicia. So again, making the point that his gospel is not of human origin. But then in chapter 2, first paragraph, it says that it was only after 14 years, because of doubts raised by false teachers and another revelation, that Paul, along with Barnabas and Titus, went up again to Jerusalem to meet privately with the Christian leaders. So really it was after his initial revelation. It was virtually 14 years before Paul met with the other disciples in Jerusalem. And just making a note that Titus, a Greek, was not compelled at that point to be circumcised. Second paragraph, the Jerusalem leaders approved the gospel Paul preached and added nothing. They extended full acceptance and fellowship. Their only encouragement was that he remember the poor in his ministry. But, and I don't think there's a but in the text, otherwise I probably would have included it. But the next paragraph, verse 11 through 13, begins to show something changed. And at Antioch, Paul confronted Peter because Peter was beginning to change from his earlier perspectives. So the circumcision group, or the Judaizers, this group was intimidating Peter and even Barnabas. So even the church leaders, so he's showing that even some of the major leaders of the church were being influenced by the Judaizers, including Peter himself. And so in the end of the chapter, then the last paragraph, Paul relates that he confronted Peter's hypocrisy. He reminds Peter that it was by faith that he himself was justified, not by observing the law. Further, we continue to live. It's not just how we are saved, but how we live as believers every day. We continue to live by faith because we have died to the law and righteousness is not gained through the law. So we're not going to achieve that goal. And then in the first two paragraphs of chapter 3, Paul turns his attention to the Galatians. So there's a shift in the development of his argument, and he strongly scolds them for their change. Are they abandoning the very way they became believers? And then this next paragraph, 6 to 9, Paul states that Abraham himself was declared righteous because of his faith. So that's as much as I put it on the PowerPoint, but hopefully you get a sense of kind of what you do. Paragraph by paragraph, you briefly, 1 or 2 sentences, keep it as short as possible. What is this paragraph about? And how does it relate to the paragraph, especially just before it, but even preceding that, whenever you can reflect that, so that you can go through, and this all get typed out on 2 pages. You can go through and very briefly read through and get a sense of the overall flow of the book. Okay, any questions or comments on that? There are examples, this example, and I may have it for the entire book of Galatians in the resources and ITS Learning. And I think there's another one maybe for Peter as well. But you can just follow that example as you do the same thing for the book of Titus. So step 3 then, after the argument, will be to do various charts. And there's 3 charts that you'll get a chance to do. You can do paragraph charts for an individual paragraph. You can do chapter charts, which is sort of a compilation of the paragraph charts. And then you can finally do a book chart, which will be step 4. But the goal in this is to continue to make observations and begin to summarize your observations into short statements or titles about what the paragraph or chapter is about. So begin by drawing a paragraph or a chapter chart. For a chapter chart, you want to include a column for each paragraph in the chapter. So for example, this would be what a chapter chart for a chapter with 3 paragraphs might look like. And so you'd have 3 columns. If it were more, you could have 4 or 5 columns, depending on how many paragraphs are in the chapter. Have a lower horizontal row, which will be the title that you give to that paragraph. And just for easy reference, I like to be sure to include the verse that begins that paragraph, so that I know that the first one is from verses 1 to 7, the second one is from 8 to 12, and the last one is 13 until the end of the chapter. So just do something simple like that. The goal is, again, to make observations. We've already done that. Okay, some further notes. Take notes for each paragraph in the chart itself. Look for main ideas in each paragraph. Look for the central idea. Try to identify the central idea and other points that are emphasized or stand out to you. Keep in mind the 6 questions: who, what, where, when, why, and how. You can just sort of go through those as you look at that paragraph. You don't necessarily have to include notes on all of those things, but just to, again, keep using those 6 questions. Note any structural relationships, and this is a very informal approach, as you'll see. But if you can begin to identify kind of what the point and what the structure of the point of the paragraph is, you can begin to note that. Look for connectives. and you can write those between the paragraphs so that you quickly see that there's the connection between the two. Again, identify the main idea of the paragraph. What does the paragraph teach, or what is the main unifying idea? What's the big idea, we like to say? So maybe what's the big idea? What's it all about? Look for broad themes within and even between paragraph and chart. So when you do a book chart, or I mean a chapter chart, and then really you can't do this with a book chart, but within a chapter chart, I'll show you an example of how you can begin to identify and draw connections even between the various paragraphs within the chapter. And then you do, and as you do this, you will compare each paragraph and section with the others. So let me give you a couple examples. This is a chapter chart for Galatians 1. And so the idea being that you could just take some notes that stand out to you that seem to, with the goal of coming up with what is the big idea, and then come up with not a summary statement, but a short title. So here I just said salutation or greeting, or you could say Paul's introduction. So you could use a number of things that would describe what this first paragraph is about. You'll see in the second column, I begin to note some things. I highlight, all caps, I underline. Paul says, "I am amazed." That's a strong statement. That says a lot about his mood, about his distress, and so many different things. And then underneath, what is he amazed about? That you are deserting him. And just taking some notes, comments, writing statements, deserting for a different gospel. But the text says not really different, but actually it's being distorted. Note that some are disturbing you. Notice that Paul says, cursed be anybody, whether it's another person or whether it's an angel. And Paul even says in there, even if he himself comes with a different gospel. This applies to everybody who preaches a different gospel than the one previously preached and received. And then I notice there's an emphasis statement, as we have said before, so say again. So these are just general statements. And my conclusion, the title that I gave for this paragraph was Disturbance of a Distorted Gospel. So the gospel was being distorted, and this was bringing disturbance to the churches. I think we might have some things later, but titles, you really want to be short, because one of the reasons for that, you want it to accurately reflect what's going on in that paragraph. You want it to be short so it's easier to remember. And you want it to be stated in a way that when you read it again or remember it, it'll recall for you basically what that paragraph is about, what it's doing. In the third column, Paul gets into more of an explanation, and just make notes that Paul preaches, what the gospel that Paul preaches is not man-made. It's not from or taught by men, to him by men, to be more clear, but rather he received it by revelation. And this is repeated in the paragraph. The box is a little lower than it should be, but talks about, or God was pleased to reveal his son, and to him personally in the revelation he received in the encounter, so that I underline, suggests purpose. And again, that's one of those grammatical terms, those words that show structure and flow. So the word "that" is oftentimes a statement of purpose. Not always, but it can be. So I see the purpose of revealing his son to Paul was that for the purpose of preaching to the Gentiles. So referring to his call. But I just note twice the idea of revelation is there. So I just box it, draw the connection for future reference. So it says, he said that I might preach to the Gentiles. I did not consult others or go to Jerusalem, went to Arabia, later returned to Damascus. So there's just kind of brief notes from the paragraph. My concluding title to describe this paragraph, again, and I just want to emphasize, we're observing. So I use the word describe, not interpret. So we're not interpreting yet, we're just observing. And the title is to describe what we're observing. Paul, so this has to do with Paul's gospel is not of human origin, as seems to be the main idea. And then he goes on 3 years later. I underline that. That's a time reference that shows a connection between the earlier paragraph and this one. He goes to Jerusalem. He stayed 15 days, saw no other apostles but James. I think earlier I said Peter. That may have been a mistake. Or I guess that's who he sees in chapter 2. Later, returns to Syria, Cilicia. And Paul makes the comment that personally he was unknown to the churches in Jerusalem. He didn't really know him personally. They heard about him, but they hadn't met him yet. And so my title, summarizing, describing this, is I think Paul is saying his gospel is not of apostolic origin either. And so it didn't come by going to Jerusalem and learning the gospel from the apostles. I went ahead and gave you also on its learning my chapter chart for Titus 1. So your assignment will be to do chapter charts for all 3, but you can look at this one as well, but you'll do your own work on chapters 2 and 3. But this is what I did for the book of Titus. A little bit more organized. I highlight certain things. The first is Paul's introduction and greeting, but it's from Paul. He described himself as a servant of God and apostle of Jesus Christ. It's to Titus, and he describes Titus as Paul's true son in the common faith. And he has a statement of what his apostleship serves, or the purpose, or the goal, or objective, or however one might eventually explain that. But for the faith of God's elect and for knowledge that leads to godliness. So I just sort of title that called, this would be Paul, called to serve faith and knowledge for God's people, as is the heart of what he's wanting to do. The second column, the second paragraph, beginning in verse 5, is Paul begins to explain the reason for why he wrote this and to whom he wrote it. So just note the 3 points. Titus was left in Crete for 3 reasons. One was to straighten out what was unfinished. 2, to appoint elders as Paul had directed. And 3, to do so, to appoint elders in every town. So I just had that as a third point. In other words, suggests that there was going to be regional responsibility. It wasn't just one church. Paul then talks about the qualifications for appointing elders. The thing that stood out to me in this passage was the word blameless. Twice, Paul introduces something with the word blameless. So blameless in family, husband of one wife, believing and behaved children, and the function is stated, the function of the elder is to be an overseer, who's entrusted with God's work. So the role of the elder is to oversee. But then again, he talks about being blameless. And now he's talking about character qualities. And first he gives a list of don'ts: not to be overbearing, quick-tempered, given to drunkenness, violent, or pursuing ill gain. I just sort of bullet point those out. Rather, and I highlight that because that's a word of contrast. It's like but rather signals, okay, there's a contrast of some kind going on here. Instead, if you will, hospitable, loves what is good, self-controlled, wholly disciplined. But again, all that's sort of characteristics of being considered blameless. In later study and understanding of that passage, I've come to some conclusions that, in a way, Paul is saying that kind of the heart of what he's looking for is men who are blameless. And some examples of what it means to be blameless in your family: husband of one wife, children who believe. So you want to look at a potential elder's family. I'm not saying perfect, but would you consider that person blameless in their family relationships? And then in character. And I've come to the conclusion, this is not an exhaustive list of what they cannot be described as and what they should be described as. But this is representative. And this could well be very contextual to the situation in Crete and what was going on. And then as I move to the area of application, I ask myself the question, in my city and in my culture and context, what would a blameless Christian leader look like? I don't want to treat this just as a checklist. There may be other things that are happening in our culture today that an elder should not be a part of and would not be a good leader, if he or even she is in leadership, is a part of. So I wouldn't say I'm only looking for these 5 characteristics, and if these 5 don'ts are true, then that's okay. There might be some others. So I think we're invited by the word blameless to thoughtfully reflect on what is needed for the church in my context, both behaviors that they should not be doing, that are not holy and godless, as well as qualities that are important for the role that they'll be taking. So that was an understanding that initially developed because I just recognized the repeated terms blameless, which the Timothy passage does not include. But then also that must hold firmly to the trustworthy message, so that, purpose statement again, so that I highlight it, he can encourage others by sound doctrine. And so my statement is simply, elders must be blameless and committed to the truth. That's how I summarize that. And then I won't go through all of the details on that. You can look at that, but in a similar way, looking for connections and relationships. The content of and the big idea of that last chapter or last paragraph in the first chapter changes tone and audience and all of that. But I noticed, you note on the top here, I put the word for. And so this is connecting. And the reason you need elders who are blameless and especially committed, holding firmly to the word of truth, is given here. For, or because. The reason these are needed is because we have a problem. And we have a problem of rebellious people who are causing trouble in the church there on the island of Crete. So I just summarized this paragraph by saying, silence false teaching, which is ruining Christian household. Probably could be more concise and memorable. That really is a little bit long. But the other thing I would point out then, I note connections between paragraphs. So the blue highlighted areas are all highlighting similar concepts. Knowledge that leads to godliness, preaching and trusted. Well, not so much there. Those two, between preaching and trusted and trustworthy message, talk about the communication, these other blue boxes, knowledge that leads to godliness. Note the word, encourage sound doctrine by teaching what should not be taught or who reject the truth. This idea, though, is, several times in one chapter, that it's a theme. That it's important. This is about knowledge. This is about truth. This is about doctrine. It's said in different ways, but the book of Titus is going to be about teaching the truth and about doctrine. And then this one is another interesting observation. An elder is to be one who loves what is good. These people who are causing problems are unfit for anything good. In probably 4 to 5 other times in the next 2 chapters, this idea of doing good keeps coming up. So that I find is a theme too, the doing of good and what we're called to do. And so I just identify that as well. Any comments or questions on this one?
It's clear.
Okay, good. And again, there's examples and it's learning. And if you do have questions as you go through the week, feel free to email me or text me. And then finally, the 4th step is the horizontal book chart. And basically, you're just taking all of your observations on your chapter charts and you're putting that together into a whole view of a single book.
Please, Professor.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
And you go back to the chart. There's one thing I want to mention.
To the chart?
That's the former chart. Okay. Here, the highlight in yellow, loves what is good, unfit for doing anything good. That's a contrast.
Well, really what I'm highlighting is the idea of good.
Okay, okay.
So that's really what I'm noticing, that the doing of good. And so mostly it's the doing of good, but in this case, because these people were causing problems for the believers there in Crete, Paul describes them. He says they are detestable, they are disobedient, and unfit for doing anything good. So in its own way, and as you'll see in the passage that you'll be doing more detailed work in Titus 2:11 through 14, God has called together a people who are zealous about doing good, who are eager, as the NIV says, but the word is actually, I think, better translated zealous. And so this idea of doing good and what believers are called to seems to be prominent idea in Titus. So that's why the two are identified. It has more to do with the idea of good than it's comparing them or saying they're the same thing. It's really a contrast. Okay?
Yes, okay.
Okay. Okay. Book chart. You want to, as you go through the argument, that'll help you do this. As you do these chapter charts, that will help you do this. But in looking for structure, watch for literary form, especially watch for transitional statements, or change of subject or content, or even you can look for changes in who is being talked about, who is being addressed. So the different things that you look for that gives you an idea of the structure of a book. Try to organize the structure by yourself first. And again, for this assignment, what you submit to me, do it on your own. And again, I'm encouraging you to work in groups. Feel free to do that. But don't go to commentaries or so on. You won't find book charts very often, but you will find outlines and those sorts of things. But again, just really wanting you to keep in mind that article, The Fish, the Student, and Dr. Agassiz. And this is what we're attempting to do with this course. Confirm or make a judgment on the organizing principle. What is the big idea, but what is the theme or purpose? How is that reflected? And how does it give the book unity? And especially if you can find a main point that seems to unify what the book is all about. So look for the purpose. Does the main idea stand out? Sometimes like Book of John, the purpose might be given for us. Is there a theme that can be traced throughout the book, or themes? Oftentimes it's plural. Watch for repeated phrases. 3rd John, truth is repeated a lot. In the Book of Leviticus, the word holy is repeated at least 90 times. There may be chronological treatment, or there may be geographical references in the book of Joshua, or historical. So the different books will have different organizing principles and how they proceed, which will influence how you would organize or outline if you were outlining. Watch for literary devices, like John stating his purpose in chapter 20, verse 31. Mark is more geographical. Matthew tends to group parable stories together, miracle stories together, conflicts with Pharisees together. So, Matthew kind of groups these together rather than being chronological. Mark might be in different regions. In the book of Mark itself, and this I wouldn't have found myself, but from others, many argue that Mark chapter 8, verses 37 to 40, really is sort of the pivotal point for the book of Mark. That sort of everything about the life of Christ and his ministry leads to a point where he asks the disciples, who do you say that I am? And Peter stated, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And from that point on, there's a movement towards the cross. And in how Mark, so it's very likely that Mark kind of is building the material to the point where the disciples recognize Jesus as God's Son, although it wasn't a perfect understanding yet. But from that point, now they are being prepared for his death and resurrection. So again, that's, sometimes you can make that yourself. You'd probably have to study that quite long, but others can help make that. Historical situations, like the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul is addressing a number of problems in that church. So those are different things that you can utilize just to kind of try to organize, and every book's going to be different. So a horizontal book chart will look like this. These vertical columns in the center, this is where you start, are the chapter or the paragraph titles for each chapter. So the first 3, and I designate that, this is the chapter division. If it has 3 paragraphs, the next one maybe has 4, and you just draw it according to the book. And then, having already done your paragraph titles for the book of Titus, you can then fill in those vertical, the first paragraph, second paragraph, third paragraph, and then in chapter 2, the next, and so on. So that part's already done. And then you can begin to give chapter titles. So this horizontal row just above, you begin to give a title that summarizes the unity, the main idea, the big idea of this chapter. And then same thing with the following chapters. And then you can begin to group chapters together and how they might be organized and how they might relate together. And then finally on the top, see if you can come up with a statement that is descriptive of the big idea of the book as a whole. So this is what you're doing there. I'll show some examples. These are down here are some horizontal columns that can be subjects to be traced. Don't always do that, but you'll see in Galatians that I found a couple of subjects that I would easily trace. And if I were to be teaching, I might use these headings as a way to approach teaching the book. So here's an example. So for the book of Galatians, just like the titles that we saw already for chapter 1, salutation, disturbance of a distorted gospel, gospel is not received from men, gospel is not received from apostles. And then, I've done this for the whole book. So then moving into chapter 2, the first paragraph, gospel is approved at Jerusalem. Second paragraph, changes in the gospel exposed. Chapter 3, not justified by the law. The second paragraph, the law shuts men under sin. Third paragraph, the law leads to Christ. Then chapter 4, Christ freed us for sonship. I probably could have even said God, that Christ freed us from the law, but really he's freeing us for some sonship. Question mark, why return to bondage? Plea to imitate Paul, so on and so forth. For each paragraph of the book of Galatians, and putting those paragraph titles in these vertical columns. And then the next stage would be to come up with a title for each of the chapters. And that's not absolute. There may be times where only part of a chapter you'd group together, and maybe you'd group one part of chapter 1 with chapter 2. Be flexible on that. But a lot of the division has already been done for us with chapters. So my group title for chapter 1 is just simply the gospel from God. Probably not the most creative, but describes that this is about the gospel and the gospel has come from God. The title I gave for chapter 2 was that Paul's gospel didn't change. He says 1, it was approved by the apostles, but 2, it was Peter and some of the others that changed, not Paul. And he confronted him on that. Chapter 3, I just entitled The Intent of the Law, answering the question, why did God give the law? If we're not saved by the law, why did God give it? Chapter 3 talks about freedom of sonship, that we are adopted in and called to be sons and daughters of God. Chapter 5 seems to be a lot of going back and forth between the spirit versus the flesh, living by the spirit rather than by the flesh. Chapter 6, there is a law of Christ. He refers to the law of Christ rather than fulfill the old law, fulfill the law of Christ. So, bearing each other's burdens, do good to all men, and so on. And then a closing. So those are chapter titles. And then you can begin to reflect the structure of the book of Galatians, or whatever the appropriate way. So you might say that the first 2 chapters really deal with an unchanged gospel. The second two chapters focus on freedom from the law. The last two chapters, the title I give it, the fruit of freedom. And again, I want to say we're not saying that there is one right answer. You want it to be descriptive, accurate as you can be, but somebody else might see it differently, and that's okay too. But hopefully, you would be able to justify why you chose the title, why it reflects, why it brings unity to the section as a whole. But then the interesting thing about the book of Galatians is you can definitely see different tones or different aspects. Like the first two chapters are very testimonial and apologetic. So in a sense, it's biographical. Paul is talking about himself, how he received the gospel, his interaction with leadership at Jerusalem. So he shares his testimony. He's also making a defense. So he's apologetic in the sense of making a defense, not an I'm sorry for something. But he's defending the gospel that he received. So it's characterized by being testimonial and apologetic. You might say it's biographical in nature. The middle two chapters are doctrinal. He's talking about the law and why the law and the promise and salvation through faith. So he's very theological. So there again, he's theological. So he talks in terms of doctrine. He's also argumentative. I might say he's more polemic, might be a better term. But he is confronting, the errors that are taking place. So it reflects some of the tone. And then the last two are practical in nature. And so it's oriented towards applying it. We have freedom, let's live that freedom. How do we apply it? And exhorting, the Galatian believers to live this way, to apply these things. And then down on the bottom are some themes to be traced. And there's a number of themes in the book of Galatians, but I chose two, and one was focusing on the gospel. So again, if I had three lessons from the book of Galatians, I could divide it in three ways. And one way would be to focus on the theme of gospel. What is the gospel? How is it determined? How did it come to us? What is taught in here? Or here it's more defining the gospel. What is the gospel? And that sort of thing, especially contrasting works with faith would be a big part of that. And then how do we live the gospel? The gospel is relevant to us every day of our earthly lives. So how do we apply that and live that out? So I could teach the book of Galatians from the aspect of the gospel, or I could focus on the theme of freedom. That where does our freedom come from? What is the basis of our freedom? What is the practice of freedom? And so that's just something that is beneficial to you. But you can see by looking just on one page, when you do something like this, you have a permanent record of a particular book. And you can go back to that. And immediately, if you're studying a passage in chapter 5, you can automatically remind yourself of the context. And it gives you a context. And again, we're doing this from our own observations. So I think you will enjoy seeing how much you can do without consulting other sources. Here's another one for Peter. I won't go into detail on this one. I didn't have any theme rows below. But my main unifying big idea for First Peter, was to stand firm as strangers in this world. And again, I use that kind of idea. The first part seemed to be focused on doctrine or teaching. The second is more practical, or on instruction and so on. Um, but an example of this is in It's Learning as well that you can look at. Any questions on book charts? And this is the end of what we're going to do. We'll look at the assignment.
My question is, when it comes to the assignment, are we going to do a number of them and we keep on improving, or you're expecting one final one done?
Yeah, that's a good question. There will be a final one, and that final one will be part of your major project. And I'm going to commit now to have that written up so that we can talk about it next week and what that's going to look like. So
you're
largely,
expecting-
it's together, but I need to make some adjustments. But yes,
So
so
we need
what you'll do for this week will be your first attempt.
Okay, I get you.
Yeah, and then you'll be able to improve it
Yes.
and make it part of your final project.
Okay, thank you, sir.
So just by way of conclusion, remember that process of hermeneutical circle. It is a process. Interpretation is not a one-time event. So you go between whole, part, whole. And initially, and in this exercise, these are tentative judgments based on your own observations. My personality is, I want to be exact. I want to be sure that what I have is right. But somebody like me has to kind of relax a little bit and allow the process to work, and then strive in a way forward to really come to some of those more firm conclusions. Make your own observations that we've been saying. Do not consult other resources. And even here, I should take this out. At this point, I don't want you to consult other resources. But down the road and in practice, when you do some of these things, yes, after you've done your own observations, go ahead and see what other Bible resources can add to help you fine tune it and improve what you've done. I'm being realistic. I know that one cannot often do book charts when studying a passage, and this time don't have the time, but at least you can do a paragraph chart or a passage. And that's a good way to start, good way to kind of think about the context and get the big idea. And ideally a paragraph chart for the paragraphs before and after the passage being studied. So depending on the nature of what you're doing, you can use this. Or if you're in group Bible study, studying a book of the Bible, going passage by passage, this idea can be assigned to the group to do during the week. Go read this passage, see what you find and observe, see if you can come up with a big idea title, for this paragraph that we'll be studying next week. Be a good way to get others to engage in the text even before you study together. Okay. Let me call up the, what am I looking for? Call up the assignment.
Do you have this presentation on the It's Learning?
I do. Let me show you. Go
We'll
back
also
to
post the
screen.
recording again for reference.
Right, and I am wanting to put up the recording. I have to check last week and find out if there's a problem there. Okay, so I'm back here. Let me do screen share. Okay, so I'm in It's Learning. Okay, so yeah, so week 4, this is the week we're in. So I have the PowerPoint is here for that we just looked at. And this is the Zoom link. I will put the recording in the same week 4 folder. And then there's the folder that has synthetic method resources. So this has several that you can look at open. You can even download them, I think. But there's an argument for 1 Peter, an argument for 2 Peter, argument for Galatians. So there's different arguments you can look at to get the idea. Oh, I'm sorry, that's 2 Thessalonians. Sorry, excuse me. Book chart for Peter and Galatians, which had on the PowerPoint. Chapter chart for Galatians chapter 1, chapter chart for Galatians chapter 2. So additional one that you can look at. And then I have that example, same thing that was in the PowerPoint. Author, purpose, theme for Galatians, that chart. I have the chapter chart for Titus 1 that we looked at. And then just a template for a book chart for the book of Titus that you can use. So every one of the paragraphs is already marked. Again, possible there's differences between versions of the Bible, but this is the NIV. And I have some horizontal that you can begin to draw your own lines and give chapter titles. You can begin to group chapters together in a way that you think is appropriate. Even add, if you think, hey, I need another column in here before I get to the top, or another row, you can add that in. And then at the top, give the book of Titus a descriptive title. You know, what's it about when you look at it as a whole? You can even note a key verse. And then you may or may not want to do this. This is up to you. But if there's some themes that you want to trace, you know, you can do that below, like I did for the book of Galatians. So that's there as well. So assignment. Straightforward. Yes, yeah, go ahead. You have a comment?
No. I asked a question earlier and you elaborated that we begin and work back and forth so that we improve.
Okay, good.
Yeah. As you get to this, just because of the previous readings, I wanted to also find out about your when the assignment in reading. Are you expecting us to write reading reports or confirm we've read in any way?
Yes, I will. I need to put a chart together so that you can indicate how to do that. So I have to learn how I can do that. If I can do that, and it's learning. But maybe not. I may have to send you something that you can download, and you can just mark when you've done the reading, and then at the end of the term, you know, turn that back into me. So I haven't figured out exactly how I'm going to do that. And part of my hesitation is that I haven't defined all of the readings yet, and in what order. So I'm hesitant, but I will get something to you. But yes, I'm going to be looking for you to do all of the reading required, and I will send you something that will make that clear. Some of the books you don't have to read all of it. So for next week, and remind me before I forget, because I might, but after we go through this, I want to talk about, I will be in Kenya in 2 weeks, and I will be available on October 5th, I believe it is, that Thursday, to meet in person. And earlier, some of you had said that would be nice to meet in person if we could. So after I talk about the assignment, let's kind of come back to that and to see if that's a possibility. So for this week, just assigning chapters 27, 28, and 30 to 33, which is about 30 pages of reading in Living by the Book. This is really serving as an introduction to interpretation. So next week, we're going to be moving into the analytical study of a passage.
Doctor, a
Go
question,
ahead.
please.
Yeah.
Have you shared this book, The Living by the Book, this in Living by the Book by Henry?
Now, have I done what with that book?
I'm asking, do we have the book? Have you shared it somewhere?
Oh, yes,
Or we
it
have to
is.
look for it?
It is available on the Global Digital Theological Library. And this is an online resource available to students at ILU Kenya. So if you're not using it yet, you need to go into, I'm not sure who, maybe the library at ILUK and see how to get access. But basically, you just need to know the institutional passcode and in order to, but they will show you how to use that. The library itself might have some lending copies. I don't know that.
Yes,
But okay.
I can confirm that they have a few hard copies.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And it may be something I would leave that for you to do. If maybe the best thing is to ask the library to put those copies on reserve. But I don't know the best, or at least one copy on reserve. Because somebody could borrow the book for 2 or 3 weeks and then it's not available to the others. But it is available digitally on the Global Digital Theological Library, or we like to say GDTL. So then for your assignment, the main thing is basically to do a synthetic study of the book of Titus, doing those readings in the way that we talked about it in the PowerPoint. So do some initial readings and then do a audience, purpose, and theme chart, like the example that we looked at. Just coming up with a preliminary summary of who is Book of Titus about. And that can include author, but also who is it being written to, or even people who are being addressed. But try to summarize who this is about, the purpose, why did Paul write this epistle, and the themes. And come up with a 2 or 3 sentence summary, like I did for the book of Galatians. And then you're going to do paragraph charts for all of the paragraphs of Titus 2 and 3. You can, I'm going to have you look at Titus 1, 2 and see what you think. I've already shown you how I did it for Titus chapter 1, but you're going to have to do a book chart for the whole book of Titus. So take a look at the paragraphs in chapter 1. You don't have to turn anything on that, but what titles would you give that you would put into the book chart? But I do want you to do the paragraph charts and do it as a chapter. So as we did in the example in the PowerPoint for both Titus 2 and Titus 3, do these separately, not on one page, but each one on a separate page. And then do a whole book chart for the book of Titus. And I showed you the template that's there in It's Learning. Or you can just draw your own and do it on your own. You're welcome to do so. All of this is available in the folder for week 4.
One moment, please.
Yeah.
Did I get it clear that We should do chapter 2 on a separate page and chapter 3 on a separate page.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Bernard, did you have a question?
Is mine Bernard? Asking to be added in our subgroup.
Yes. I meant to do that actually already. And yesterday, and it just slipped my mind. So I'm going to add both you and Simon to the WhatsApp group. Good. I'm glad you clarified. I needed to ask about your first name because the official roster that I received had
we are not-
Bernard with an R, but it is Bernard.
I'm not also on the WhatsApp group together with Amy.
Ah, you should be.
This
You're
is
listed.
Weldon and Amy.
Yeah. All right. I will check on that.
Bernard Jage.
So what I'll do later is I will add Bernard and Simon because I know you haven't been added yet, and I will check. I will probably just set. Well, I may, in order to test it, I guess I have to send to the group, but I'll send a test to the group, and Emmy and Weldon, be sure that you respond back so they know whether you get it or not. But I'll do that later today.
Okay, that's good.
Okay. So just finishing up with this, so all of these examples are in the chart. And so you're doing, let me see if oh, you know what? I'm sorry I didn't include this, but I'm going to add it here. Well, I can't do it on the spot. So I want you to do an argument. I'm sorry that I forgot that. I'm going to have you do an argument for the book of Titus also. So I will make an adjustment on this assignment soon. And so, do an audience purpose theme chart, do an argument for the book of Titus, do those paragraph or chapter charts for Titus 2 and 3, and then finally put it all together in a book chart. And again, you may work together. You may share ideas and collaborate as you kind of talk through this. I'm really interested in that you really get a sense of how this works and so on. Really expect that everybody's participating in any kind of collaboration and sharing. But when you turn in your own. So this isn't a group project as such, but you're going to turn in your own charts and own argument and book chart and so on. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes, it
Yes,
does.
it does.
Right.
Okay. Well, let me close. I will make some of these changes quickly, but it's now 2 p.m. my time and I haven't had lunch, so I will take some lunch first before I come back to this. And I'll let you go so that you can get a good night's rest. So let me close in prayer. Father, we're thankful for this time and just want to pray for this group of students as they work through these processes, these charts and different things, Lord, that you really would enable them to really gain confidence and help them to think clearly and sharply, to be effective and efficient in what they do. Father, we do pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
Okay, very good.
Esther, can I see you for 1 or 2 minutes?
Daktari too, me too. I
Okay.
wanted to, yeah. On the fourth part, on making the book chart,
Yes.
is it okay if we use your chapter 1 and chapter 4?
Um, well, if that works for this one, that's okay. But when you do the final one for the major project, I want to see what you've come up with. So take a look at it. See if you think that you might give it a different title. You don't have to put as much work as the others. And feel
Okay.
free to change the title. If you use the same title, I'm not going to object to that.
Okay, okay.